Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. Paris is often seen as a plum posting for foreign correspondents. Sometimes it's seen as being a reward for a long stint in tough places. But having to decipher the French and their behaviour is not an easy job. And one person who knows that too well is Alan Cowell, a senior correspondent for the New York Times, who's been based in Paris since 2008 and has now just written a book which will be published in October, aptly entitled The Paris Correspondent. He joins me in the studio today. Alan Cowell, thank you so much for being here. Why is it that it appears that every foreign correspondent who comes to Paris is overwhelmed by the need of having to explain the behaviour of the French to the rest of the world?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the question is whether it's the correspondents themselves or, in fact, the situation they find that where a lot of the people here, the government leaders, people themselves, the people on the street regard themselves as being part of the French exception, that they are different, that this is a different society from those you find elsewhere in Europe, and I guess that's where the challenge initially comes from. And of course, France has a long, long history of intriguing outsiders, whether it's in the manner of the Second World War at its one extreme, or the grand voyages of the 19th century. This has been, Paris in particular, has always been a place where you have to go to. It's a destination, even today, that people feel if they're going to travel, they're going to do Europe, then they have to come to Paris.
But they find the behaviour of the French rather perplexing, don't they?
I think less so than perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. There was a time I can remember that, if you didn't speak good French, I mean seriously good French, you weren't going to go very far. A lot of French people speak very good English now. There's been a shift. And you can start a conversation, and if your French isn't as brilliant as it should be, then you'll be politely reminded in good English that you can conduct this conversation in English.
But it's not just the language barrier, there's also a cultural barrier in terms of the way in which the French view life versus the way in which us Anglo-Saxons view life.
Well, there you're getting into the realm of caricatures, and I think there's something in that. I think there is a French way of doing things that is not readily opaque, transparent to outsiders, even very close neighbours like the French or the Germans, like the English or the Germans.
And you're an Englishman, aren't you?
And I am an Englishman working for an American newspaper. So I think you do find this, and what we have to try and decipher whether that's a defence mechanism or whether it's a completely different way of doing things. I was reminded of that just the other day on a vacation. I spent a few days in Brittany. I got on a ferry to go across to Plymouth in Devon in England. There was something magical about those small Brittany villages, as if people really set high standards in France for what they wanted for themselves. And you didn't find that in England. England seemed, by contrast, in Plymouth, was depressed and used to taking second best. I think that's a very important thing in France. The French people do not like to be thought of as being anything other than deserving of the best.
And that can sometimes be misconstrued as being arrogant, can't it? This is where the sort of...
Well, then you're back into the caricatures, and I really would like to try and avoid caricaturing. And there's nothing worse than Englishmen saying, oh, the French. We can do that during the Six Nations rugby tournament, but we shouldn't really do it in polite society.
Since you know the country well, what is it that makes France so different, though?
I think there is something about France that is linked, now this is going to sound very fanciful, I think it's linked to the idea of romance. I think when people come to France, they're expecting, as visitors, they're expecting that there'll be something romantic in the air, or that they're coming back to rediscover a time of their lives when they were wrapped up with a situation or a person in Paris, and here they are back again to try and pick up the strands. I don't think people come to Paris just to see the sights. They don't come here just to see the Mona Lisa. I think they want to experience something special, and Paris is quite cynical knowing this and knowing that it's probably a little bit of a myth, but nonetheless keeping up that appearance that this is the city of light, the city of romance, the city of love. And I think that is very important. That was the background to what I was writing about in my book rather than in the newspaper.
You can see that even in films recently released, such as Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, which had this very one-dimensional view of Paris as viewed by Americans of a certain class, which is exactly that sort of Disneyland view of impressionist artists and all the good things that one thinks about Paris. But the reality is actually quite different, isn't it? Because when you head out into the suburbs, the banlieue, there's a different story out there to be told.
It's A Tale of Two Cities, originally by Dickens, was about London and Paris. There's two cities in Paris. That's clearly the distinction between the centre and certainly the arrondissement where most visitors find themselves and most foreign residents are, and the banlieue, where it's a much grittier environment, where we've seen riots in recent years, and it's a different kind of France, just as England is different now because of the whole demographic development in the past decades. So too is France, and almost from a similar background of being a post-colonial power.
Now, let's talk about the article that you wrote recently about the impact of globalization on Europe. And I quote one paragraph in which you write, "French people these days are in smart business clothes who use their company meal coupons to buy lunchtime sandwiches, not three-course meals, just like Londoners flocking to Pret-a-Manger, itself a hybrid." Are we talking about the end of French culture as we know it?
I think we're going through a modernization phase. We're going through a phase where, after all, Europe as a whole, for decades now, has been hurtling towards much more open borders, much freedom of movement, much greater prosperity. I think people go to England, French people go to England or Germany, they see how other people live, the English and the Germans come here, they see how the French people live. I think that's one reason that cafe society, as we've known it in Paris, is now such a common attribute of life. Almost everywhere you go in Europe, people like to sit outside. Now, of course, there is a rather more prosaic explanation that they can't be inside if they want to smoke, so they have to be out on the sidewalk. But I also think there's a cross-fertilization, a cross-pollination of European trends. It's not always a good thing. We've seen reports of binge drinking a la Britain in Paris, and that's the kind of export of cultural standards that France would probably resist. What you also see in my little neighborhood of Paris is that Starbucks has moved in, that the number of bars with happy hour has moved in, that the sound of broken glass on the street has moved in a way that would never have been countenanced in the more elegant days of France as a centre of culture and refinement.
So are we seeing the end of the French exception?
The end of the French exception, I'm not sure people are quite ready for that. Even if it were actually on the street, that you could say people are exactly the same as they are, which they aren't. I think that France will cling to that exception. You've seen that in the leadership role it takes in Europe. You've seen that in the military sense. I think in just across society, France will cling to that exception and will also justifiably argue that its exception has brought very, very specific benefits that other people in Europe don't have.
And just when you think the cultural gaps might be narrowing, along comes the Dominic Strauss-Kahn affair. If anything, has that created another Franco-American cultural clash?
I think the way that was covered in New York, that story of Strauss-Kahn when he was accused of sexual impropriety in a hotel room, it highlighted, I think, a very, very clear gulf in the perceptions of Americans and French over what's right. I think in a way it was a wake-up call to France that you can't continue in outside of Paris. In the modern world, you cannot continue the way people always have with this sort of dominant male character.
And it's certainly prompted a lot of soul-searching here in France, hasn't it?
I think there was a lot of soul-searching. There was a lot of soul-searching not only for men of a certain age, but also if you think about it among journalists. I mean, journalists in an Anglo-Saxon culture are very, very used to the idea that they can go around and push their noses in, wherever they feel like. In France, there are taboos, or there were taboos, and it's be very interesting to me to see whether, when we get to an election in this country next year, a presidential election, whether you're actually going to find again that certain areas of politicians' lives are off limits, although they're known to the journalists. And I think that this need for transparency is something that you're seeing in France and also in Britain in a different way because of the whole affair of the News of the World and phone hacking. So in both countries there is a pressure, I think, for a kind of transparency and a rethink of the relationship between the press and the politicians, between the people who speak truth to power and the people in power who receive it.
Alan Carl, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us, and that's it for this edition of the Franz van Kaart interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up shortly.